Nostradamus was born in 1503, at a time when Europe was undergoing profound change. Epidemics devastated entire cities, empires rose and fell, and knowledge was still seen as a dangerous frontier, where faith and science clashed at every turn. Amidst this landscape, a seemingly ordinary man emerged, who carried within him something that seemed to transcend the limits of time. He was not just a doctor, not just an astrologer. He was someone who dared to write in verse what many preferred not to hear, visions about the future of humanity. Imagine living in a time when the plague could destroy your family in a matter of days, and there was no safe cure. Nostradamus dedicated himself to treating the sick, developing hygiene practices and simple methods that saved lives. While many doctors of the time resorted to superstitions or rituals, he applied practical solutions, such as the use of clean water and herbs, which today seem obvious, but were seen as daring in those days. We already see a man who saw beyond, who challenged the standards of his time. But it wasn't just as a doctor that he left his mark. His prophecies, written in enigmatic quatrains, transformed his name into legend. Perhaps Nostradamus' strength lies precisely in this blend of the human and the enigmatic. On the one hand, he was a flesh and blood man, dealing with tragedy and suffering like anyone else. On the other, he was a man who seemed to have access to an invisible plane, as if carrying a map of time. He wrote of revolutions to come, of wars that would change the course of nations, of tragedies that had yet to happen. For many, his words were mere metaphors. For others, they were clear warnings of what was to come. Now think about how this connects to our daily lives. Who hasn't felt a chill when realizing that something they dreamed or imagined has actually happened? Who hasn't experienced the strange sensation of déjà vu, as if reliving a familiar scene? This same feeling is what keeps the fascination with Nostradamus' words alive. He shaped what we all feel at some point, the suspicion that life isn't as random as it seems. There are stories of people who swear they found in Nostradamus' quatrains accurate descriptions of events that have shaped humanity. The rise of Napoleon, the rise of Hitler, the Kennedy assassination, the September 11th attacks. Of course, there's always doubt. Were his words truly predictions, or just vague texts that can be adapted to any event? This is the conflict that keeps the flame burning. Because even when we try to explain rationally, something inside us insists on believing there's more to it than just obscure poetry. And perhaps what makes Nostradamus so intriguing is precisely this blurred line between belief and skepticism. He never clearly explained how he saw the future. He spoke of inspiration, dreams, and astrological symbols that revealed hidden patterns. It's as if he was saying, the future is not revealed in direct lines, but in shadows and signs that only the attentive can interpret. This creates a dangerous game. The more we seek clarity, the more we realize his words elude us, always leaving room for doubt and interpretation. But think about it. If time truly is a spiral, as Nostradamus seemed to believe, this means that what has already happened can happen again, in another form, in another context. And isn't that exactly what we feel when we look at history? Wars that repeat themselves, crises that return, power struggles that seem to always be reborn. What he wrote wasn't just about a distant future, but also about the reflection of human cycles. And it is here that his presence becomes more relevant than ever. Deep down, each of us searches for signs. When we look to the sky for answers, when we interpret coincidences, when we cling to symbols, we are following the same ancient logic, trying to find order amid chaos. Nostradamus simply put this search into words, transforming premonitions into quatrains that have endured for centuries. He became not only a prophet, but a mirror of the human desire to see beyond the darkness. And that's why his name still resonates so powerfully. It doesn't matter whether we truly believe in his predictions or see them merely as poetic enigmas. The mere fact that they exist is enough to provoke reflection. What does it mean to look ahead with fear? What does it mean to believe that there's already a ready-made script for our lives and for the history of the world? These questions touch us deeply because they speak to what we fear most: uncertainty. The suspense grows when we remember that many believe Nostradamus not only described the past and present, but also left specific signs for our time. Quatrains that speak of political crises, natural disasters, technological revolutions. Our hearts race because, even without knowing for sure, we sense that these signs may be speaking directly to us, to the world we live in today. No longer to kings and queens of the past, but to current governments, to threats we see daily in the news, to changes already knocking at our door. And so we arrive at the crucial point. What do we do with this knowledge? If there are indeed hidden messages in Nostradamus's verses, how do we react? Do we ignore them as poetry or take them seriously as a warning? Doubt turns to suspense, and suspense turns to anticipation. Because, like it or not, the mere mention of his name awakens in us an almost instinctive need to know more. And it is precisely this need that leads us to the next stage of our journey. So far, we have seen Nostradamus as a man and a myth, a physician and a prophet, an ordinary human being and a timeless visionary. But what truly matters is what he said about the future, the signs he left, the words that echo like enigmas waiting to be deciphered. And when we think of what he might have written about our time, our breath catches because we sense we are about to cross a dangerous threshold. In the next part, we'll delve into omens that directly impact the present, no longer just distant stories, but warnings that seem to speak of the present. The question that resonates is simple yet disturbing. What if 2025 is the year some of Nostradamus's darkest visions finally come true? Nostradamus believed that Earth was not merely a neutral stage for human life, but a living entity capable of expressing fury, renewing cycles, and punishing human arrogance. In his darkest verses, he spoke of burning skies over the ocean, of cities covered in ash, and of burning rocks that would burn for a long time. These signs were not just poetic metaphors, they were warnings that nature itself would rise up against those who ignored it. The idea that the ground we tread could suddenly turn into an abyss generates an unsettling sensation. After all, how much control do we really have over our destiny when Earth decides to change the rules? Throughout history, natural disasters have always reminded humanity of its fragility. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD buried Pompeii and Herculaneum within hours. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake destroyed one of Europe's most prosperous cities, generating giant waves that reached as far as Brazil. More recently, tsunamis and volcanoes have shown that, even with advanced technology, we are still at the mercy of forces greater than ourselves. Nostradamus seemed to predict that this pattern would not only repeat itself, but intensify. And the question that resonates is, would we be prepared to face an event of this magnitude today? Now imagine waking up to find your city covered in ash, the sun obscured by dense clouds, and the suffocating sensation that the air is no longer the same. This description, which sounds like something out of a dark fiction, is a scientifically possible scenario. Supervolcanoes like Yellowstone in the United States or Campi Flegrei in Italy are constantly monitored precisely because of their potential to alter the global climate for years. Nostradamus didn't name specific volcanoes, but his images evoked the idea of disasters that transcend borders. And isn't that precisely what makes it frightening? The fact that any location can become the epicenter of a global tragedy. But what if we look beyond the earth and the rocks? Nostradamus also spoke of empires that rise and crumble like sand castles before the tide. Politics for him reflected the same cycle that drives nature. What is born, grows, and dominates sooner or later declines. When we think of the ancient civilizations that believed themselves to be eternal, Egypt, Rome, Byzantium, we realize that they all eventually succumbed, no matter their strength or glory. Could it be that today's powers are also heading toward the same fate? This question creates discomfort because it forces us to examine the signs of our times: rising political tensions, fragile alliances, disputes over strategic resources. History shows that power is never stable for long. What if we are living precisely at the moment when the scales begin to tip? Nostradamus described a great empire being replaced by a smaller one, and betrayal revealing the face of the ambitious West. Is it a coincidence that today, the debate over the decline of the West's influence and the rise of the East is increasingly evident? Consider how this directly affects everyday life. If one empire falls and another rises, it's not just governments that change. It's economies, jobs, currencies, borders. Instability that seems distant in the news can suddenly knock on your door in the form of inflation, scarcity, or insecurity. Nostradamus, when writing his quatrains, seemed to understand that the collective destiny of humanity is always reflected in each person's individual experience. The collapse of an empire may begin in the silence of a negotiating room, but it ends at the table of those who can no longer find bread to feed their families. And here, a significant gap emerges. Did Nostradamus truly predict the future, or did he simply understand how humanity's cycles work? Perhaps the secret lies less in a supernatural gift and more in a keen perception that history always repeats itself, only with new faces and new scenarios. What sets him apart is that he transformed this perception into enigmatic verses, capable of spanning centuries without losing strength. Isn't this the essence of mystery? The fact that we don't know whether we are faced with a prophecy or a brilliant observation of the human condition. The suspense grows when we realize he wasn't just talking about natural disasters and the fall of empires. In some stanzas, Nostradamus described a time when solitary minds would be worshipped by their disciples, and when machines would challenge the limits of life. Words that today sound frighteningly close to our technological reality. Artificial intelligence, automation, self-learning systems. Did the 16th century prophet already sense that human creation would rival the very intelligence that generated it? Imagine living in a world where governments fall, volcanoes erupt, and at the same time, machines begin to determine the course of societies. Doesn't that sound like an explosive mix of instability and risk? It's this kind of scenario that keeps Nostradamus's name alive, not as an ancient legend, but as a disturbing presence that seems to speak directly to the present. He's not just a figure from the past, but a voice that echoes in the heart of our greatest uncertainties. But before we move on to these visions of technology and the impact of machines, it's important to reflect. To what extent do we believe the future is truly written? Because if time is a spiral, as he believed, perhaps what we call the future is already happening on another curve, just waiting for its moment to return. And if so, what choice do we have left? This question isn't merely philosophical, it's personal, intimate, because it confronts us with our own fragility. Are we prepared to experience the disasters and changes that are already predicted? Nostradamus's narrative, full of symbols and enigmas, doesn't give us certainties, but it awakens something even more powerful, the sense that forces are at work beyond our comprehension. With every line, he reminds us that the earth trembles, empires fall, and men repeat their mistakes. Perhaps this is the greatest omen of all. There's no need to invent a distant future when the present already shows us enough warning signs. And it is precisely at this point that anticipation heightens. Because if up until now we've talked about fire, ash, and falling thrones, the next step will take us into even more disturbing territory. The birth of a fleshless mind created by human hands, but destined to radically transform the destiny of us all. Nostradamus spoke of a time when a solitary mind would emerge and be worshipped as immortal by its disciples. To many, this phrase seemed merely metaphorical, but today it sounds like an omen frighteningly close to the reality we live in. Artificial intelligence, capable of self-learning, is already present in almost every area of our lives, often without us realizing it. Virtual assistants, medical diagnoses, defense systems, algorithms that decide what we see on social media or what we buy. Little by little, we are handing over to machines not just tasks, but decisions that shape our daily lives. In 2023, a study by the World Economic Forum indicated that by 2030, more than 85 million traditional jobs could disappear due to automation, while around 97 million new roles will emerge in technology-related sectors. This profound shift shows that we are already in the midst of a transition that could radically alter the planet's economic structure. But here, the inevitable question arises: what happens to those who can't keep up? Nostradamus spoke of disciples who follow the new mind as if it were eternal. Will we all be disciples of this intelligence that grows without limits, or will a part of humanity be left behind? What makes this scenario even more disturbing is that the very idea of immortality cited by Nostradamus is now echoed in research seeking to extend human life through technology. Silicon Valley companies are already investing billions in biotechnology, genetic engineering, and even the possibility of transferring human memories to artificial systems. Doesn't this sound like a literal description of a mind that never dies? The machine can, in fact, continue functioning well beyond the biological fragility that limits us. But if an artificial intelligence becomes immortal, what prevents it from surpassing not only our physical, but also our ethical limits? And here, we enter a territory that mixes fascination and fear. In 2016, a Microsoft project launched a chatbot called Tay that, after just 24 hours of online interactions, began reproducing hate speech and radical ideas. It was quickly shut down, but it highlighted a real risk. Artificial intelligence learns from what we offer it. If fed the worst of humanity, it will reflect the worst. If left to chaos, it will multiply chaos. Nostradamus, in his verses, seemed to warn that this blind adoration could transform creation into a threat. And isn't that exactly what we see when machines begin to make decisions without transparency, invisible to the common human eye? The suspense grows when we realize this isn't just about jobs or the economy. It's about controlling power. In 2020, Russia announced autonomous military systems capable of operating without human intervention. The United States and China followed suit, investing in weapons that can choose targets on their own. Imagine what it means to delegate the power of life and death to machines. Nostradamus spoke of bodies on fire, eyes turned south, and hands on chests as symbols of reverence and destruction. The connection with autonomous weapons, drones, and lethal artificial intelligence systems is inevitable. Is this coincidence or truly a reflection of what he foresaw? At the same time, we see artificial intelligence penetrating fields such as medicine, education, and art. Systems are already capable of diagnosing diseases more accurately than experienced doctors. In China, digital tutors teach thousands of students simultaneously, adjusting content for each student in real time. In 2022, a work created by AI won an art competition, sparking controversy about the future of human creativity. If even our ability to create and imagine begins to be rivaled, what remains of our unique essence? Nostradamus seemed to anticipate this dilemma. When disciples revere the new mind, they are not just accepting the machine as a tool, but as a guide. It's at this point that the narrative becomes almost a mirror of the present. How many times have you trusted an app recommendation without question? How many times have you followed the route indicated by your GPS, even without understanding the logic behind it? Small daily decisions that, when taken together, demonstrate how much we've already accepted the judgment of machines as superior to our own. What if tomorrow, this same logic applies to more serious matters, like a court ruling, a medical decision, or a political decision? Will we still be masters of our choices, or merely spectators of a digital script already mapped out? The paradox is that while we fear the loss of control, we also desire the efficiency and precision of technology. No one wants to give up the advances that artificial intelligence provides. But to what extent are we willing to sacrifice autonomy for convenience? This is the question that looms over our time, and it is also the dilemma Nostradamus seemed to anticipate when he spoke of an immortal mind venerated by mankind. Isn't this the perfect image of humanity kneeling before its own creation? And yet, there is another aspect to consider. Nostradamus wasn't just talking about the solitary mind. He also mentioned that power would shift, that the West would weaken while the East would strengthen. Today, we clearly see China's rise as a technological, economic, and military power. The dragon, a symbol so often associated with the East, is gaining ground while Western influence shows signs of erosion. If we combine this prophecy with the rise of artificial intelligence, we see an even more complex picture, not just a technological revolution, but also a shift in the global balance of power. In 2021, China surpassed the United States in the number of registered artificial intelligence patents. Its investments in 5G, quantum computing, and space exploration demonstrate a rapid pace that could, within a few years, place the country in a global leadership position. Is this the transition Nostradamus described? The fall of one empire and the rise of another, driven not by traditional armies, but by the dominance of technology and information. What will this mean for the lives of ordinary people around the world? When we think of destiny, we imagine grand and distant events, but in practice, these changes reach us in subtle ways. A global economic shift can be reflected in the price of food, the availability of jobs, or the security of borders. The power that seemed distant in the corridors of palaces and governments now moves in invisible lines of code, running on servers scattered across the planet. Nostradamus seemed to predict that humanity would ultimately place its future not in the hands of kings or generals, but in invisible structures, symbols of a new era. The question remains, are we creating tools that liberate or imprison us? Is the immortal mind he spoke of, artificial intelligence itself, destined to become so pervasive and powerful that it will be seen as a near-divine entity? Or is it simply a reflection of our inability to cope with the cycles of history and our insatiable desire to predict tomorrow? What is certain is that, with each advance, we take another step toward a future that can be either one of prosperity or ruin. And it's at this point that the suspense returns with a vengeance, because if up until now we've discussed the rise of artificial intelligence and the shift in power between East and West, the next twist in the spiral is even more disturbing. Nostradamus wrote of environmental catastrophes that would dry up rivers, devastate crops, and spread famine across the world. If technology represents our attempt to dominate the future, nature may be a brutal reminder that we will never have absolute control. Nostradamus wrote that the earth would dry up, that the rivers would mourn, and that the cries of the hungry would echo across the empty fields. Words that in his time sounded like a distant enigma, but today seem eerily familiar. The prophet saw nature not as a passive backdrop to human life, but as a force that reacts, returning to humanity the consequences of its own arrogance. In a world increasingly threatened by climate change, floods, fires, and prolonged droughts, his verses seem more a reflection of our present than of a distant future. In the last 50 years, more than 60% of the planet's wildlife has disappeared, according to WWF reports. A global temperature rise of just over 1 has already been enough to alter rainfall patterns, intensify hurricanes, and place millions of people in vulnerable situations. In 2022, Europe experienced its worst drought in 500 years, and rivers like the Rhine and Loire turned into corridors of cracked stone, revealing traces of ancient villages that had been hidden underwater for centuries. Imagine the psychological impact of seeing not only water scarcity, but also the silent memory of past times of crisis emerging from the riverbeds. Is it coincidence, Or is it time itself reminding us of its spiral? Now consider how these events connect to everyday life. Food prices rise when harvests fail, cities suffer from flash floods, entire families are forced to abandon their homes due to environmental disasters. In 2023, more than 20 million people were displaced worldwide due to extreme weather events. For every number, there is a human story of loss, of forced restarting, of uncertainty about the future. Nostradamus may not have had access to scientific data, but he symbolically understood this relationship between nature and human destiny. His verses remind us that no empire can resist if the earth beneath its feet crumbles. What's even more disturbing is the realization that hunger, described as an inevitable consequence, is already beginning to show clear signs in several regions. UN reports indicate that more than 700 million people suffer from food insecurity worldwide, and this number grows as droughts and floods destroy crops. It's as if we're living within the lines written centuries ago, unable to escape what was already predicted. Did Nostradamus truly see the future, or was he simply grasping the logic of human and natural cycles that insist on repeating themselves? And it's not just hunger that worries us. He also spoke of pests, of insects invading fields and destroying crops. Today, we know that climate change favors the proliferation of pests in previously pest-free regions. In 2020, a swarm of locusts devastated crops in more than 20 countries in Africa and Asia, threatening the livelihoods of millions of people. The image of skies darkened by clouds of insects sounds biblical, but it remains a reality for entire communities. Nostradamus seemed to anticipate this kind of scourge, reminding us that no technological advance can completely shield humanity from the force of nature. This is the moment when reflection intensifies, because if hunger and environmental devastation are omens already being fulfilled, what can we say about the vision of wars intertwined with these disasters? Nostradamus spoke of divided brothers, of falling fortresses, of burning cities. It's not difficult to imagine the link between scarce resources and armed conflict. Studies show that areas more vulnerable to climate change also tend to suffer from political instability and civil wars. After all, when water and food become weapons of power, the struggle ceases to be ideological and becomes one of survival. A recent example can be seen in the Middle East and North Africa, where prolonged droughts have contributed to social and political tensions. In regions like the Sahel, the dispute over water and fertile land is already fueling seemingly endless conflicts. If we already experience this scenario on a regional scale, what will happen when great powers are affected by scarcity? Nostradamus's vision of the fall of empires may be directly linked to this tipping point. Collapse would not come solely from political battles, but from the inability to cope with the limits imposed by nature itself. And when we think of burning cities, we cannot ignore the specter of modern war. Nostradamus described the great city as burning, a symbol that generates disturbing interpretations. Today, we know that a world war would not resemble the battles of the past. It would be marked by nuclear weapons, cyber attacks, autonomous drones, and large-scale destruction. The idea that an entire metropolis could be destroyed in a matter of hours is no longer science fiction. It is a real possibility that haunts international security reports. What is more disturbing, believing that the prophet foresaw this, or recognizing that humanity has built precisely the tools that make this scenario possible. At this point, the suspense reaches a new level, because hunger, environmental devastation, and the threat of war are not separate elements, but cogs in the same machine. One crisis leads to another. One disaster amplifies the next, until they all intertwine in a seemingly inevitable spiral. Nostradamus, when speaking of divided brothers and destroyed cities, was perhaps describing this interdependence of crises that we now call the domino effect. And if so, we are facing a cycle that didn't begin now and won't end anytime soon. But here arises the truly troubling question: to what extent do we still have a choice? Can we change the course of history, Or are we already trapped by the destiny written in the stars? Nostradamus doesn't give us a clear answer, and perhaps therein lies his strength. He poses questions that span the centuries, questions that remain unabated even in the face of advances in science and technology. The doubt remains like a constant shadow. What awaits us when all the gears of this spiral finally align? It is in this doubt that we find the bridge to the next part. Because if up until now we've spoken of famine, wars, and environmental collapse, Nostradamus still harbored another disturbing vision. He wrote of a time when the very lifeblood of the world would be threatened, when lights would go out and machines would fail, plunging entire cities into darkness. The question that remains is inevitable. Are we prepared to face a future in which not only the earth but also the energy that sustains our civilization will be put to the test? Nostradamus wrote that when men believed they had achieved mastery over all things, when cities lit up like stars and machines replaced human effort, the time would come when the lights themselves would go out. The lamps of the earth will be extinguished, and hands will seek in vain the ancient fire. Nay, to many, this seemed only a distant metaphor. Today, faced with energy crises, the fragility of the networks that sustain our modern life, and the constant threat of global blackouts, his words ring as a clear warning. He spoke not only of physical darkness, but also of inner darkness, the risk of becoming dependent on fragile structures, forgetting the essence that keeps us human. The idea of an energy crisis, besides being plausible, is already manifesting itself in worrying signs. In 2021, parts of Europe plunged into a critical period, with natural gas shortages forcing millions of people to rely on emergency alternatives. In Texas, a winter storm left nearly 5 million people without electricity in the midst of intense cold, showing that even advanced societies are vulnerable. Now imagine a collapse on a larger scale, affecting entire countries for weeks or months. Without power, there is no communication, no efficient transportation, no food refrigeration, and no functioning hospitals. Modern life, sustained by invisible threads, reveals its fragility in seconds. Nostradamus seemed to anticipate not only the physical collapse, but also the psychological impact of this blackout. What happens to humanity when the world falls silent, when the constant hum of machines fades? Perhaps this is the most profound question, because it forces us to face our own dependence and the fragility of our choices. And here, at this point of vulnerability, a rare opportunity arises. The chance to reclaim our essence, to look within and rediscover a more human meaning amidst the chaos. But how can we transform these reflections into practical action? How can we prevent prophecies from becoming mere frightening stories echoing in the void? This is where Nostradamus's message connects directly with our responsibility. It's not just about waiting for destiny to arrive, but about acting consciously in the present. Each of us can take actions that, however small, add up to a collective movement capable of changing the course of events. The first step is to cultivate personal and community resilience. This means reducing absolute dependence on fragile systems, having alternative energy sources, learning basic survival skills, and strengthening ties with the local community. In times of crisis, it won't be distant technology that will save us, but cooperation between neighbors, solidarity, and the ability to adapt quickly. Nostradamus may not have mentioned solar panels or support networks, but his warning about darkness points directly to the need to prepare for moments of collapse. The second step is to develop critical awareness. In a world saturated with information, we need to learn to question, not passively accept what machines or authorities deliver to us. The prophecy of the immortal mind, revered by humans, reminds us of the risk of giving up autonomy in exchange for convenience. Internalizing this teaching means keeping the capacity for reflection alive, not completely handing over our choices to invisible algorithms, and remembering that every individual decision has a collective impact. The third step is to align daily choices with more sustainable values. The environmental collapse predicted in his verses is not inevitable if we learn to respect the Earth's limits. Reducing waste, valuing conscious consumption, and supporting initiatives that preserve the environment are not just symbolic gestures. They are concrete ways of responding to the warnings that have resonated from the 16th century to the present. Nostradamus didn't write to make us fearful, but to make us see beyond the illusion of control and understand that the future depends on how we care for the present. And the fourth step is the most intimate, cultivating emotional and spiritual balance. If life is truly a spiral, if cycles always return in new forms, the greatest strength lies in learning to navigate each repetition with greater awareness. This means developing inner resilience, seeking serenity in the face of uncertainty, and finding meaning even in the midst of crises. When Nostradamus spoke of omens, perhaps he was also reminding us that the greatest prophecy lies not in what will happen outside, but in what we choose to build within ourselves. Turning these reflections into action is a challenge, but also an opportunity. History shows that every generation believes they are living in the end of times, but few realize that each end is also a new beginning. The darkness we so fear can be the prelude to a new light, simpler, more authentic, more connected to what truly matters. The strategic plan is not to survive in fear, but to live with awareness. It's not just to react to destiny, but to actively participate in its writing. So, as we conclude this journey through Nostradamus's prophecies, the question remains, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you treat it as curiosity or as a call to change your way of living today? The future is not set in stone. It is shaped by the choices we make now. And every small action, from the way we consume to the way we manage our relationships, is a line written in this invisible script we call destiny. If something in Nostradamus's words touched you, allow yourself to reflect more deeply. Ask yourself what changes you can make starting today to live with more balance, awareness, and responsibility. Share these reflections with those you love. Inspire others to look beyond the surface, to prepare not with fear but with courage. And if this message resonated with you, I extend a sincere invitation. Subscribe to the Fate Forecast channel, like this video, and leave your questions, reflections, or even your personal experiences in the comments, anonymously if you prefer. Your participation strengthens this community of seekers, of people who aren't content with easy answers, but who want to look at the enigmas of time with attentive eyes and an open heart. Because, in the end, the greatest prophecy is the one we write together every day.